Hello, everyone. Do you think it is possible to forgive an infidelity? Why, yes or no? Thomas always thought his life was perfect. After 7 years of marriage to Elizabeth, they had created what seemed to many to be a picture-perfect life. A spacious home in a quiet New York suburb, a secure job at an investment firm for him, and a stable career in advertising for Elizabeth. Their son, 5-year-old Jaden, was the center of their world. Together, they looked happy and successful, just like a family life should look. But, as often happens, behind the perfect exterior was a crack that was about to turn into an abyss. It all started on an ordinary evening. Thomas came home from work a little later than usual. The kitchen smelled of Elizabeth's stew, and Jaden was enthusiastically drawing something in his sketchbook. Thomas always loved these evenings. This time, however, something was different, a slight chill in his wife's demeanor that he hadn't noticed before. When they sat down to dinner, Elizabeth put her phone on the table next to her. Thomas had never been interested in her gadget, believing that trust was the foundation of their relationship. But this time he happened to notice the screen light up with a new message. For a few seconds, he saw the words, "Today was great. I miss you." This short phrase knocked him off balance. Thomas's heart sank. Something was wrong. Elizabeth quickly turned off the screen and calmly continued with dinner, as if nothing had happened. But Thomas could no longer concentrate. He barely finished his meal, feeling like a guest in his own home. His thoughts were confused. Who could have sent this message? What did it mean? I miss you. Is it possible that Elizabeth, his perfect wife, has secrets? That night Thomas could not sleep. He turned from side to side, trying to find an explanation for what he had seen. Every time he closed his eyes, new versions appeared before him. A romantic letter from a stranger, mysterious meetings behind his back, infidelities he hadn't noticed for years. Even those moments that had seemed ordinary before now took on a different meaning. Why has Elizabeth been staying late at work so often lately? Why did she start taking better care of herself, buying new clothes and cosmetics? The next morning, Thomas began to notice details that he had previously ignored. Elizabeth spent a lot of time typing messages to someone on her phone. When he walked into the room, she quickly put the phone back in her pocket. Her smile seemed strained, and her words were hollow. He could no longer look at her without feeling pain and doubt. The situation became even more acute when Thomas decided to talk to a few friends. He cautiously brought up the subject of infidelity in marriage, trying to find out if they had ever experienced anything like it. One of his friends shared his own story of how his ex-wife had started to secretly date a coworker. Thomas listened to this with alarm because he saw many parallels with what was happening in his life. The final blow was what he learned from one of Elizabeth's friends. This woman, who happened to be a neighbor in the office, told Thomas that she had seen Elizabeth in a cafe with a man she did not know. They looked too close to be just friends or colleagues. These words were the last straw. Thomas decided to act. He could no longer sit back and wait for the truth to come out. He had a plan, but it was not a plan that would lead to reconciliation or understanding. Instead, he chose revenge. The feeling of betrayal, like an invisible snake, slowly wrapped around Thomas. Every moment, every thought poisoned his mind, forcing him to replay scenes that may not even have existed in reality. Why this message? Why now? He seemed to be suffocating in a sea of suspicion and uncertainty. The words on his phone, which he read by accident, became the kernel around which a whole network of doubts grew. His brain did not give him any rest. At night, he lay awake, staring into the darkness where the worst-case scenarios seemed to be born. Why does Elizabeth stay late at work? Who was she texting with when she turned her phone away? Her new clothes and lipstick, which she had said were for client meetings, now looked like evidence of something worse. Thomas felt trapped. His suspicions were too strong to ignore. but the evidence was lacking. Every little thing about Elizabeth's behavior now seemed suspicious. When she laughed, Thomas felt that it was not for him. When she left her phone with the screen facing down, he was torn by anxiety. He began to look at her as a stranger who had come into his life to hurt him. At work, Thomas became distracted. Colleagues asked him if he was okay, but he just waved them off. His mind was far away from the familiar office environment, returning again and again to the moment when his phone screen lit up with the words, "Today was great. I miss you." One night, as they were eating dinner, Thomas couldn't take it anymore. His hands were shaking as he held his fork. It seemed to him that Elizabeth was hiding something, but he could not bring himself to ask. The room was quiet, with only the sound of the dishes filling the space. Thomas realized that the silence was destroying him from the inside, but he didn't know how to start a conversation. A few days later, Thomas decided to turn to one of Elizabeth's friends, Melanie. She had always been there for them, always supported their family. Her warm words, friendly smile, and attention to Thomas had seemed like something ordinary before, but now he saw it as a chance. Melanie was not only close to Elizabeth, but also perhaps the weakest link in the situation. She might know more than it seemed at first glance. At first, Thomas simply asked her for advice, what gift to choose for Elizabeth, whether she looked happy in their relationship. Melanie answered, as always, with warmth and compassion. At one point, however, her words alerted him. She mentioned that Elizabeth had been looking a little distant lately. This phrase, like a spark, ignited his imagination. Thomas began writing to Melanie late at night, telling her about his doubts, hinting that he felt lonely. Melanie, who also seemed to feel some emptiness in her life, quickly responded to his attention. They began meeting for coffee and talking for long periods of time on the phone. Whenever Thomas felt betrayed by Elizabeth, he sought comfort in Melanie's words. It was no longer just a conversation. Thomas began to see Melanie as someone who could fill the void that had appeared in his heart because of his suspicions. But it was all just a game he started to take revenge. One evening, Thomas decided to go further. He asked Melanie to meet him at a restaurant where no one knew them. Her eyes shone with joy, and this only strengthened his conviction that he was in control. After dinner, they walked together to the hotel. Thomas felt a strange triumph. He had done what he thought Elizabeth had done. His revenge had become a reality. At that moment, however, Thomas felt a sense of anxiety. Something in Melanie's eyes, in her words and actions, made him wonder if this was really the right thing to do. But it was too late. They had crossed the line, and now there was no turning back. Meanwhile, Elizabeth noticed changes. Her intuition told her that something was wrong with Thomas. She decided to start monitoring his behavior, but she was careful not to arouse suspicion. And one day her suspicions were confirmed. She saw Thomas and Melanie leaving the hotel together. Her world fell apart. Elizabeth held out for a long time. She watched Thomas, studied his behavior, and waited for the right moment. Her suspicions became reality when she saw Thomas and Melanie leave the hotel with her own eyes. Her world seemed to collapse in an instant. But instead of giving up, Elizabeth decided to fight back with all her strength. She was not the type to submit to circumstances. She channeled all of her feelings, pain, anger, frustration into a plan that would make Thomas face the reality of his actions. Elizabeth knew that the key to success was control and composure. The first step was to gather evidence. She hired a private investigator who was able to record several meetings between Thomas and Melanie. She carefully kept all the photos, messages, and other evidence. This became her weapon. Elizabeth spent many nights thinking about every step. She would sit in the kitchen with a cup of tea, staring at her phone. Her fingers mechanically scrolled through the photos and messages that were proof of her betrayal. Each view made her heart sink, but at the same time strengthened her resolve. The next step was a cautious return to normal life. Elizabeth became more caring and even renewed her romance with Thomas. Her behavior did not arouse suspicion, and Thomas, immersed in his relationship with Melanie, did not even notice the changes. He believed that everything was under control and his revenge plan was working. But it was only an illusion. One evening, Elizabeth invited Thomas to have dinner at home with friends. She invited several close people, including Melanie. The evening began as usual: laughter, wine, and light conversation. But the tension was building. Elizabeth was ready to strike the decisive blow. She had carefully prepared for this dinner. Everything in the room was perfect: the scent of fresh flowers, carefully chosen lighting, and a gourmet dinner. Elizabeth looked gorgeous. Her smile seemed sincere, but her eyes held an icy determination. Thomas was in high spirits, confident that his secret had gone unnoticed. He joked, toasted, and even paid attention to Elizabeth so that everyone would think their marriage was perfect. When the guests gathered in the living room, Elizabeth pulled out the evidence folder and calmly placed it on the table. Everyone fell silent. "I want to share with you something that is important to me," she said, looking directly at Thomas. Then she opened the folder and pulled out the first photo of Thomas and Melanie leaving the hotel. The guests began to whisper, and Melanie turned pale. Thomas froze, his face reddening. Elizabeth didn't give him a chance to defend himself. She showed all the evidence, including screenshots of the messages and the detective's testimony. Every moment, every detail was aimed at showing the truth. Elizabeth's words were cold and clear. She explained in detail how she found out about the affair and showed how long she had been watching Thomas. Her voice did not tremble, but tears shone in her eyes. It was a moment when she completely exposed her feelings, but at the same time demonstrated her strength. The culmination of the evening came when Elizabeth calmly said, "Now each of you knows the truth. What happens next is up to Thomas and his choice." Her words sounded like a sentence. Thomas felt the ground slipping from under his feet. He wanted to justify himself, but all eyes were on him. The guests were uncomfortable and tried to avoid making eye contact with him. Melanie sat quietly, not knowing what to do with her hands. The atmosphere in the room was so tense that it seemed the air could be cut with a knife. Elizabeth left Thomas in the face of his guilt. She said nothing more, just turned to the guests and suggested that they continue with the dinner or leave. Several people stood up and left the house, not wanting to witness what was to come. Others stayed, but their faces expressed shock and confusion. Thomas realized that his plan of revenge had failed. What he had conceived as a way to repay a perceived betrayal had turned into a disaster that destroyed his reputation, his marriage, and his relationships with his friends. He was left alone in the wreckage of his life, trying to understand how things had gotten this far. Thomas sat in the darkness of the living room, listening to the silence that seemed more oppressive than any noise. The guests had long since left, and Elizabeth had taken Jaden to her parents' house. The evening that had started as a pleasant get-together had turned into a complete collapse of his life. Memories of the events of a few hours ago came back in waves. His wife hadn't screamed, cried, or accused him. She had simply told him the truth. It was even worse than if she had made a scene. Her calmness was the most devastating. It seemed to Thomas that he had lost not only her trust, but also a part of himself. Elizabeth, meanwhile, had mixed emotions. She believed that she had done the right thing by exposing Thomas's infidelity, but there was an emptiness inside her. She thought her pain would go away after the truth came out, but it didn't. Instead, she felt tired and deeply saddened. The next morning, Elizabeth took action. She contacted a lawyer to discuss the divorce process. She didn't want to take revenge or destroy Thomas, but she also realized that it was impossible to go back to the way things were. Their marriage had become an empty shell, and she decided not to hold on to the past. Thomas tried to regain control of his life. He met with Melanie, but their conversation was short and tense. Melanie, feeling ashamed and guilty, did not want to keep in touch anymore. She realized she was only part of Thomas's plan, and it left her feeling betrayed and disappointed. Thomas was also facing problems at work. Rumors of his infidelity and the drama at the dinner quickly spread among his friends and acquaintances. Some of the clients he had worked with for years began to avoid him, considering him unreliable. Thomas lost not only his family, but also his professional reputation. Elizabeth, on the other hand, found support among her family and friends. Her determination and strength impressed many, and this became the basis for her recovery. She began to spend more time with Jaden, trying to provide him with stability during this difficult period. Her career in advertising, which had been just a job, now became a way to rebuild herself. To regain her balance, Elizabeth decided to get involved in charity work. She joined an organization that helped women in difficult life circumstances. Her own experience made her not only sensitive to other people's pain, but also able to inspire others. Every story she heard only confirmed that her decision was the right one. Meeting women who were rebuilding their lives after betrayal, loss, or violence gave her a sense of purpose. A few months passed. Thomas tried to meet with Elizabeth to talk. He wanted to apologize, to explain his actions, but Elizabeth remained adamant. For her, this relationship was over, and she no longer wanted to open old wounds. Her coolness confused him again, but this time he realized that she was no longer his wife. She was a self-sufficient person who had stepped out of the shadow of his betrayal. Thomas began to search for meaning in a life that now seemed empty. He turned to a psychologist, trying to understand why he had done this and what had pushed him down this path. During therapy, he discovered a lot about himself, about his fears and insecurities that were hiding behind his desire for revenge. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was blossoming. She decided to change jobs, accepting an offer from a large advertising company in another state. It was a new beginning not only for her, but also for Jaden. They moved to Boston, where Elizabeth found new friends and colleagues who supported her. Jaden quickly adapted to his new school, finding new friends and activities that excited him. Elizabeth was relieved to see her son enjoying life. She realized that her decision to divorce had given them both a chance for a better future. A year passed. Thomas and Elizabeth officially divorced. Thomas continued to live in their former home, which now seemed empty and cold. He sometimes saw Jaden, but their meetings were short and awkward. Thomas realized that he had lost his chance to be the husband and father he was supposed to be. Elizabeth, meanwhile, had turned a new page. She focused on her work, raising her son, and her own development. Although the pain of her betrayal still lingered somewhere deep inside, she learned to move on. Her story inspired many people, and she became an example for women who experienced similar difficulties. One day, Elizabeth received a letter from Thomas. In it, he thanked her for the lessons she had taught him and admitted that he had only now begun to realize how wrong he had been. He wrote that he hoped that someday she would be able to forgive him, although he realized that this might never happen. Elizabeth read the letter and put it away. She felt no anger or pain, only peace. She knew she had done the right thing for herself and her son. Her life had moved forward, and now she looked to the future with hope. Final question to the audience. What would you have done in Elizabeth's place? Could she have saved the marriage, or was her decision the only right one? Write in the comments. I'd love to hear from you.